All right, I think we're live. Welcome everybody to our webinar. Thank you for attending. Amazing turnout, by the way. As you know, today we're talking about Black Basta, which is a Russian-linked ransomware group and a recent event where they targeted a client environment of ours and kind of what unfolded and any lessons learned. There's no deck, there's no demo. We're just here to share essentially a case study for the community. Really quick housekeeping. We aim to keep this concise and informative, but also want this to be collaborative and answer your questions. So we encourage you to ask along the way. If you notice on your sidebar, there's a little convo bubble with a question mark. Just dump questions in there and we'll do our best to kind of work through those. Ideally, keep questions out of the chat so we can track them better, and just please keep it respectful in chat. With that out of the way, the actual stars of the show with me today is the team that was in the trenches, pretty much. You saw this all unfold and worked to stop it. So we have Stephen Drenning, who is a security analyst and reverse engineer. We have Stephen DeSorbo, who leads our security operations team, and Champ Clark, who's our very hands-on and involved CTO. So I'll actually shut up now for most of this and turn it over to Champ. Maybe super quick, just frame up kind of who Quadrant is for people who don't know, and then kind of dive into the story itself.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, this isn't about like showing a 20-minute long demo and going through all that, but we have to pay the bills. So Quadrant is an MDR service. We actually monitor clients' networks for potential breaches. We do this through a combination of usually packet analysis and log analysis. We also tie into endpoints and different APIs and things of that nature. We're also a big advocate of open source software. So some of the software that we use are things like Suricata, and we actually developed a log analysis engine called Sagan. If you're interested in that, that's over on GitHub. You can find it there. But basically what we do is when we see bad things happening in clients' networks, we try to assist in any way. That could be from a standpoint of from detection down to the IR process. And with that, I think that's enough for our little sales pitch there. I don't really like watching videos that have real long ones, so I think we should go right into it. This was in September, about mid-September, we had a client that was breached, obviously by Black Basta, the ransomware group, and we published several technical papers about what we found, about how the incident took place. There should be links, I believe, within the show notes, or you can find them on our website. These go into everything from like the reverse engineering of the particular pieces of malware that were discovered, to the C2 traffic, to the types of logs that we've seen, down to monitoring the threat actor in the network, pivoting in the network back to their own systems, and discovering like what their backends look like, using things like paste logs and stuff like that. So in September, there was I think it was September 20th, a phishing email was delivered. And just to kind of kick it off, the phishing email, if I recall correctly, was a ISO type of image. And one thing that I found interesting about this is that we found some services like Office 365 didn't natively, by default, block ISO images. But to talk more about on the ISO image, I'm going to let Mr. Drenning and DeSorbo, and I'll kind of step in as we go about what they discovered in that ISO image.
So with the ISO image that was part of the phishing email, it was disguised as a PDF, but when you clicked on it, it asked you to enter in a password. So you had that user interaction there. And then after that, it installed a Quackbot malware, which is I don't want to say fairly common, but it is a well-known Trojan backdoor that's out there on the internet. And it installed it on the system. And shortly thereafter, it started reaching out to multiple C2 IPs. During this process, Cisco AMP actually detected this. However, at the time, we were not, as a company, ingesting the Cisco AMP logs from our client. Had we we probably could have stopped it right then and there. However, after about 30 minutes or so, the Quackbot finally connected to one of its C2 domains, and from there it actually downloaded a second stage, which was later determined to be Brute Retell.
Right. And one thing I'd like to point out too is that during that 30-minute period where there was C2 traffic, it was going to a lot of different C2 domains. AMP picked up on, I believe, just one of the C2 connections that it was. At that particular time, a lot of the C2 traffic at that particular time was pretty clean. That's pretty much right, isn't it, Drennan?
Yes, sir. That's correct. Out of all the IPs, when we were investigating it, which was between 100, 120, something like that, only one kind of came back with something even slightly suspicious through abuse IPDB. All the other ones were clean. The reason why AMP actually detected this was because it was trying to communicate over a non-standard port. It was trying to reach out over port 2222, which when you see that, you initially think that, hey, maybe this is an SSH connection, because that's a fairly common alternative port. But through our analysis and after looking at it a little bit deeper, it actually looks like it was trying to make a HTTPS connection over that.
Right. And one of the things that we also found too is that, and this happens in a lot of networks, the client was in flux. That is, nowadays all the networks are fairly dynamic. So they were actually looking at different endpoint solutions. Cisco AMP was actually what happened to be in place. And at that point in time, with them trying to figure out what they were going to keep and what they were going to do, we weren't, as Quadrant, ingesting the Cisco AMP information through API. Obviously, as the attack progressed, one of the first things that they gave us access to was the Cisco AMP API to further help monitor the network during that situation. And also the alert fired. And unfortunately, at this time, when you have a lot of different security tools in the organization, sometimes what happens, a lot of different screens to look at, some of those tools don't get monitored maybe properly, or they may not have it enabled to automatically email because they're afraid it's going to flood their mailbox with like false positives and don't have the time to dedicate towards it. So with that in mind, we found out about the alert, I think a few days or a day after the event took place. I'll just kind of continue on with it. So so if you looked at it, it looked like around, I'm looking over my notes here, it was around noon, the phishing emails were hit. It hit two particular users. The emails were coming from a trusted third party. So the trusted third party was more than likely compromised, but we never really understood what the extent of that compromise was. So, and what the attackers did was they injected themselves into a middle of a already established conversation, at least on only one of the email campaigns, right? So, so one of them, as I recall, and these guys actually probably know better than I would, but is that one of them was established through an already existing email, so the third party had emailed them, they had responded, the third party had emailed again, they responded, then the threat actor responded. And then the other one was actually a clean attempt, just like a flat out new email, if I remember correctly. And so out of all their users, and this was not a small organization, two of them had clicked on it. And unfortunately, the ISO images had been let through, which allowed them to execute it and then to trigger off the chain of events. So when we looked at it, it looked like, according to the notes here, it was about 12:38. So about noon, the phishing emails were delivered. C2 was established. It looks like probably about 30 minutes later. It went through a lot of different domains trying to establish that C2 connection. One thing I'd like to say is that a lot of organizations have satellite branches. In this particular case, the satellite branch had some visibility, but not a ton. Again, in the middle of restructuring, pulling in new security tools and things like that was actually a lot to the attacker's advantage in this particular case. So after C2, what do you guys think from the standpoint of what happened next?
So after C2 was established, the next thing that really happened was Kerber roasting and attempting to kind of establish your presence in there. Afterwards, On the second day, I know they started doing reaching out and contacting their FTP sites. In fact, if I remember correctly, they discovered that rclone, which is a really handy tool for sending a whole bunch of data really quickly over FTP and other services. But that was not on our client's infrastructure. So they said, hey, we can just download it. So they downloaded it and they installed it, and then they started actually sending data out.
I'll answer just like a couple of questions that have come up here. There was one question about how old the email threads were. They were pretty recent, as I recall. These weren't like email threads that were very, very old. As for how long that they were inside the infrastructure, that was from start to finish. How
Less than 4 days, I think.
Yeah, less than 4 days. You remember? So at this point, just to point out, at this point, there's been, other than the AMP alert that nobody's looking at, there hasn't been any indication of anything happening within the organization. It's just business as usual. So looking through the logs and even the packet analysis level a little bit later on, we're kind of like, at this point, we don't know what's happening within the network. So this is kind of like that backward view. We're looking back and looking at how it initially got. Because like in these kind of situations, one thing that, if you can catch the attacker very, very early on, and you're confident that the dwell time's not a lot, mitigation gets a lot easier. But at this point, we don't know that the attacker's in the network. And actually, when we do find out, we're not sure how long the dwell time is. So for instance, to go through and say, okay, well, we'll just start mitigating the attack. We don't understand how the attack took place in the first place. So we're having to go back and look through a lot of data. And so some of that is like going through the logs and once we find out. We don't really find out to what's happening until day 2. Now on the curb roasting stuff, how did you guys determine that? Was it more of a kind of an educated guess? I know there was a little bit of visibility there. Or what was the situation there?
I think we found the logs, right? Didn't we see a plethora of like 4769 events in there, and just like a bunch of one-to-many requests, like within a short amount of time? I think it was thousands and thousands of them.
Right, it was thousands in the span of a couple hours.
Yeah, but we didn't get the logs till after, if I remember, because the DC that got roasted was not reporting to us at the time.
Correct. So again, this goes back to visibility and things like that.
Yeah, we knew though about those visibility gaps, and we were in the process of addressing it because there were infrastructure changes and things like that. So
right.
It wasn't an oversight. It was just something we were in the process of fixing. So.
Right. So then Kerber's happening, and then on day 2, we see a download of rclone and data exfiltration. Well, really, let's back up a little bit. At some point, it looks like they definitely did, compromised a file server at that standpoint, and had downloaded rclone and then attempted a outbound FTP connection. What we found interesting about this is that when we looked later at the Black Basta side of things, they were using VSFTP. It was a Debian 11 Linux box running VSFTP, and they had actually, it looks like had toyed with setting up FTP using over TLS. But for whatever reason, they did not have that enabled. So it was flat out FTP. So at that point, they decided to make an outbound connection to an FTP server that was located, I think, in Miami, Florida. It was a piece of hardware, like a rented server that they had there. And when the alert fired off, the alert was actually a FTP make directory buffer overflow, I believe. Which actually, to the analysts, if I remember correctly, looking at the particular event, was like, well, number one, it's weird that it's FTP, and number two, I don't think this is an overflow, but I don't like the looks of this. And that's like a area that I think where having a good SOC and a good team and understanding the data that you're looking at is a really, really big plus. So to their credit, they said, I don't like the way this looks. And that's whenever the contact started. And at that point, I think from the FTP event and the initial connection, from the beginning of the phishing campaign to the FTP connection, how long was that? How long was the dwell time at that point? Do you guys remember?
I believe it's just over 30 hours between when the user had opened the phishing email to when data started leaving the network.
Gotcha. So now we have the alert go off. So our security operation team, I think, had called them within a minute or two of seeing the FTP traffic, and got somebody on the horn at the client to ask, like, would this be normal? We've never seen this kind of stuff before. They started to just like look at it and say, you know, this doesn't look right, and started to kind of get people into the know. At some point, and actually I don't really recall this, you guys are gonna have to recall, was it directly after that phone call, did we receive another phone call where it was like, hey guys, you're right, this isn't normal? Or did that happen on the same phone call?
We called them and they went and looked into it and they got back to us. I think maybe it was the next morning that they confirmed that it wasn't. I mean, we kept digging, right? I think all through that afternoon. And this, I think, directly correlates to one of the questions right now, which is what about the FTP overflow data did the SOC analysts not like? With any of our alerts, our analysts aren't just taking them at face value. We have access to raw logs. Our analysts know how to go in and dig through that kind of stuff. So they would have gone through and looked at the entire session, the FTP, and seen everything that was being transferred. And they saw the amount of data, the varying file names, how long the connection was, and things like that, and made a determination based on that information that it was, at the very least, abnormal to reach out to the client.
So what was interesting about this too is like when you looked at the FTP session and the actual signature, the signature I believe is an older signature. So it was looking for data links of the make directory FTP command. So it was like saying, if I see a directory link over X number of bytes, this might be an overflow. But there was no indications of like shell code or anything like that. It was just straight out large file names. And that is kind of what the analysts immediately knew, like, I don't think this is not an FTP overflow, but I don't like the fact that we're getting FTP traffic and it's from this server heading out. And then that's when the conversation kind of took place. So at that point, now we know kind of what's going on. This means it's going to be a long, hard weekend of work. Very little sleep at that standpoint.
Yeah, it was.
That's what comes with the territory, right? So now at that point, we start looking backwards, and we're looking back at the how things were established. So as I said, I'm the CTO here. So my conversations, like, I get to work a lot with the technical teams, which is where I really, really love to be. But I also have to work a lot with the C-level folks as well. So at this point in time, I was having back-end conference calls with the CISO of this organization, and we were talking about this. And so conversations then come up of like, well, let's just stop the FTP traffic. The only problem there is that you're kind of tipping your hand. And by this point, I can't remember if we might not have known this was Black Basta quite yet, but you're tipping your hand to the attacker. And if you do that, retaliation can come back. So we were really hesitant on that. And then you're having those back-end conversations, and obviously you're working with a client that's not too pleased about the situation. And be honest, neither are we. And kind of trying to set things up. So one of the things that we talked about earlier is to have staff in place, get ready, and are you comfortable in, basically shutting down this organization for a set amount of time, so that this can not only be mitigated, but this can also be cleaned up afterward. And luckily, the client, to their credit, was incredibly good to work with. They were knowledgeable, they knew what they were doing, they understood the impact of the situation, and then understood like why we were giving them the advice that we were giving them. We have had organizations that get really hesitant on that, and the outcomes can be kind of fishy at that point. So we started looking back. What was from you guys? I remember there were several things that I remember, for instance, Disorba, you said that you thought it was Black Basta early on. Maybe you could talk a little bit about like what attribution, like how did you attribute, if you remember?
I was just trying to go through that and figure it out. I think it was some keyword in one of the documents, because we asked for a copy, right, of the email, I think, and we started trying to pick it apart as soon as possible. And it was something in there, just a combination of searching the web to try and see if anything stuck. And I think there was a keyword there. And then I saw we got a listing of all their AMP alerts, and one of the AMP alerts had something related to that in it as well, which kind of confirmed it. And then as we really reversed that, or as Drenning reversed that, we were able to just unanimously attribute it to Black Basta.
There's two questions that are up that I'll answer real quick about using public DNS or secure DNS. I don't feel like in this particular situation it would have really helped either way. They had literally set up the exfiltration site days, I'd say maybe 10 days before. And they might even be using direct IP connections. I can't recall. I'd have to go back and look. So there was that as well. And I can do there's another question here about what were they using to stay hidden. I'll talk about that a little bit later. From that standpoint, we're going back. I know that you guys started running into, so for instance, like one thing that we do on servers is we will do things like clipboard logging. And so we use a piece of software called NXLog. We use the Enterprise Edition for Windows logs. And it comes with a lot of really nice features. And one of them is clipboard logging. And what clipboard logging allows you to do is on, say, domain controllers, record what's happening on the clipboard. And what's interesting, that data does not get stored locally on that server. It gets sent over to us for further analysis. So like the attacker doesn't even know that the clipboard logs are even happening. So I know at some point we started things like Russian comments and stuff like that. And I know these guys did, for instance, we would find PowerShell and things like that being executed and looking at how the PowerShell was executed, going back to other great research that's been done by many different people about Black Basta to kind of like correlate that and say, yeah, we're pretty sure that this is a Black Basta operator. So from that, we had the alert go off. Is there anything that you guys want to cover that I missed on that, on the FTP, the exfil, lateral movement, anything at that point?
No, not a lot of the discovery came after we ended up pulling the plug, right? So a lot of it came prior or after that third day when we were able to actually figure out because of some of the visibility gaps.
And as we're going along, the client is also trying to improve our visibility as we went along. So for instance, as Desorba mentioned, we started getting alerts from Cisco AMP and any other devices that we didn't previously have data to.
Yeah.
So at some point, we're still trying to struggle with like how the threat actor got in. We kind of have some ideas now about how the threat actor got in, but at some point, we're starting to, still trying to understand mitigation. But the process came down to, well, we're going to have to watch everything, and then I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, I might be wrong on this. I think the idea was to stop the FTP traffic first.
Yeah.
So at that point, we knew that bad things could go sideways pretty quickly at that point. But we also couldn't let the exfiltration go out. There are some things that I'll touch on real quick, just because they've come up in previous conversations. So for instance, why didn't we apply QoS to the outbound FTP traffic? Which is a great idea, but it largely depends on how the firewalling is set, or excuse me, the QoS is set up. Some systems you can set up, when you set up QoS, it'll apply to every new connection that's set up, but you can't necessarily apply it to the current connection. And also, as you would probably guess, during this whole process, the organization was in the middle of pulling in a new Cisco network manager. So we are also down a resource as well. So we didn't necessarily have hands-on keyboard that we wish we had had. We had actually started arranging for a third party who are more Cisco experts than we are to come in and help us with that process. So that was a good thing. Did you guys? There was a conversation here.
I think that kind of ties into the question that's up there. Is that what you're about to get to?
Yeah, I was going to. Why don't you take it? I'm not sure which question you're referring to.
What type of retaliation were you concerned about? What type of behavior have you seen historically? Yeah.
So what Black Basta likes to do is a double encryption or double extortion scheme. So they encrypt your data, but then they also release your data. They find that they get more bang out of their buck that way. So we're stopping the exfiltration side of it. Then the immediate next thing is to encrypt everything. And one thing that we tell clients is like, these guys are actually very good at what they do. So for instance, their retaliation will happen very, very quickly. So for instance, the type of retaliation that we saw, and be honest, kind of expected if that were going to be the case, and it did end up being the case in this, was to reset and all the administrator passwords and try to get everybody off the network and basically take over the network and then start passing the dash bomb flag to their executables to start fully encrypting the network. That's why at that point, having that person on site right when the retaliation happens was vital for us to have somebody who could basically pull the connection. I always call it like the big pause switch. It's like everything's going sideways, things are going rapidly downhill. Let's just hit the big pause button and stop everything. But again, like a lot of organizations, it might be hard to get them to do that in the first place.
We knew about the attackers way before they knew that we knew about them, which was a big advantage for us. And we knew, like Champ said, that until we could really cover all our bases and know what kind of footholds they had into the network, any action we take could have just been catastrophic for the client, right? Which is how we ended up, ultimately pulling the plug. But it gave us the freedom to kind of assess the situation holistically and really cover all of our bases so that, yes, we know we're going to take the network down eventually once we're comfortable with it. When we bring it back online, right, we need to make sure that everything just doesn't instantly get encrypted. So that was a huge, I feel like, step up that we had over most organizations, because more than 90% of the organizations out there that get to this point where in ransomware and a ransomware breach are going to get encrypted. They're going to pay ransom or it's going to be detrimental to their business. So
yeah, and to that point, whenever a situation like this happens, cyber insurance kicks in a lot. Yeah. So even though we're doing IR on our side, and we love to work with other IR firms, a third-party IR firm was brought in. And one great thing was talking with them, and they had some statistics that were directly related to Black Basta. And one of their statistics was that in this particular situation with Black Basta, it was like 1% or maybe 1.5% of people at this stage are done, or survive this point, I should say. The 99% are done at this point. They're going to be encrypted. There's no turning back at this standpoint. But anyway, so that was a little bit interesting. But keep in mind, at this point, we simply have found out there's FTP outbound exfil. We've gone through. I think these guys have done some work on identifying who the threat actor possibly is. We're kind of ahead of the game. So when the IR firm shows up, they show up a day or two later. They have to get contracts signed, fly out there, get on site, so that when they showed up, we were like, here's a whole ton of IOCs. This is what we're seeing. Like, we believe working insanely as hand-to-hand with IR firms as possible. So we're handing them all kinds of data. So then we roll into day 3, because we haven't even really, to be honest, we kind of skipped ahead a little bit about pulling.
Sorry.
No, I did it too. So we had noticed, by this point, our SOC already knows, by the way. We've already communicated through our SOC. Like, we know that there's a compromise taking place over here. We're trying to be very careful and tread very lightly as to not have everything go sideways. I'm having conversations in the back end with people like the CSO at the organization, talking to them, how do you feel about your backups? And they had just recently moved to, I think it was Veeam immutable backups. So that was good. And basically saying, identify those, get that stuff ready to rock and roll, because if things go really bad, we're going to need to access those. This is the time to make sure your ducks are in order. Luckily for them, from that standpoint, we all felt fairly confident on that side. So, having those type of backups or offline backups was super, super important. But around day 3, around noon Eastern time, we know the threat actors in the network. We're still trying to figure things out. We've really been involved for maybe 20 hours at this point, I would guesstimate. We see new administrator accounts. Adminius
was, I think, is what it was.
Is created by a compromised account and is added to the domain groups. Obviously, we have signatures for this. So we're actually on the phone and through a out-of-bands communications with the client.
Yeah.
One thing to quickly point out is when we are in a situation like this, we do a lot of out-of-bands communications because we're trying to figure out, we don't quite know yet what the attacker has access to. So for instance, when we've dealt with Office 365 breaches, we don't send data via email anymore. Like we actually set up out-of-bands communications so that we can tell the client what's going on without the attacker actually knowing what's going on. So was there anything to the domain admin and RDP and Cobalt Strike? There's some stuff up there that happened within that time that I'll let you guys talk about from the malware and the malware side, the stuff that's being copied and stuff like that.
Go ahead, Training. Yeah, no, please.
I remember the client's team was very proactive in getting us as much information as possible. Some of the things off the top of my head is they were so on top of it, they started seeing these strange .bat files flying around their network. And they're like, we have no idea what this is. Can you take a look at it? So they were able to send us those over. We were, myself and our detection engineer, we were able to start analyzing those and going through those. And then just, I want to say midday on day 3, that's when the tox5.exe popped up, which we believe is a stager for Cobalt Strike. We were able to take a look at that, and we were able to do much more in-depth analysis afterwards. But we did start during the process. Go ahead, Disorder. I didn't mean to cut you off.
I was just going to point out something that's obvious that they did originally use FTP here, and we were FTPs in clear text, and that's all I'll say. So I think they were attempted to use VSFTP, right? Or
Well,
that
they're
was the
using,
intention?
that was a service on the back end. They were using
Yeah.
FTP server VSFTP, but it was never set up for TOS.
There's a good write-up on that one. We're probably not going to address much of it today, but I recommend everybody go read that one.
Yes. So then they were like, how are they moving the files throughout the network?
Good question. So they used a kind of whatever would work based on where they were in the network. We saw PSExec, which is, of course, remote management tool, right, from sysinternals. RDP, we saw that a lot, just copying and pasting in file shares. We saw attempts at Print Nightmare, or what we thought were attempts at Print Nightmare, but we didn't see, we saw the enumeration part of it. We didn't see that it was successful. And we did see bits admin a couple places as well. So it was really whatever flavor they could get to work to pivot around the network. And that's also the same case that we saw with the .bat files for shutting down the EDRs, right? The malware would just create it based on whatever EDR it saw.
Yeah, it was 2 separate ones. One was for, if I remember correctly, it would decode to PowerShell for turning off Windows Defender, and then the other one was for the Cisco AMP solution.
And on the one for the PowerShell, I think they were doing some interesting encoding of that, obfuscation, I should say, of that, which we talk in the technical article about that. They're also moving the files. I mean, so we would see, so what was interesting is we didn't have a lot of east-west traffic. We, in this particular case, we have a north-south, but we did get some east-west traffic because the way that this particular client was set up is they had your typical kind of core router so that we could see data going between satellite branches. So they have kind of like a main office and several satellites around them. So in order for a satellite branch to communicate with another satellite branch, it'd have to go through their core. And we were picking that up through a span, and then using things like Suricata and doing the Suricata grates out some really, really good network flow type of data. And it's not like net flow like your old like net flow kind of garbage. It's like it goes through and gives you a lot of information about like what the file was, what the command was it to delete, access, create a file, stuff like that. And so they were masking that as, if I remember correctly, there's like ticket something .xls.
Yeah,
you know, reading it that way.
Ticket-5731. Never forget it.
Nightmares.
And attach it on your arm. So we're seeing that, and then at about 5:59 EST, it says Black Basta detonated via RDP. So what was the story there?
Go ahead.
Was that when they passed the dash bomb flag?
That was when we noticed the dash bomb flag, correct?
Which, how did you guys feel about seeing a dash bomb flag?
Anytime you see a dash bomb in an active situation, you kind of do one of those, everything kind of puckers up for a second.
Right.
You know it's not going to be good, whatever it is.
So to be clear, we saw this via clipboard logging, right? This it wasn't that they actually detonated the ransomware just yet, because they had in some locations, but it wasn't like a mass detonation, right? But the clipboard logging is just that. It's literally logging copy and pasted data, so, which we'll talk about later. We got some very interesting stuff out of that.
Okay.
If memory serves, the clipboard logging that we saw that in was directed towards their ESXi environment,
Which did get detonated. Yeah.
Right. Which I think there were 3 servers that got encrypted in the ESXi. They have a rather large environment, so that was not terrible. I mean, the whole situation's terrible, don't get me wrong. But what I'm saying is, given the facts and the way things are. So around that point, the client decides, okay, we're going to attempt to try to do some mitigation here with a little bit of information that we know. We're still going back. We're still trying to understand patient 0 at this point, or patients 0 at this point. So we're not 100% in a situation where we completely understand, but we're kind of like, well, you have to do something about this. You can't let exfil continue to happen, and then you have to somehow start to mitigate. But that was also the standpoint too. I was like, be ready to be on a phone call. I mean, because the second that you do this, either 1 or 2 things are going to happen. 1, they'll retaliate really quickly, or 2, they're going to, you get really lucky and you're successful. So the client then attempted to take all the accounts that we thought that they had compromised and started resetting passwords. The threat actor at that point then retaliated and had basically a script, which you can go find in the technical details of our write-up. A script, it looked like probably a batch file that they just executed immediately and then reset all the passwords for the threat actor, for the administrators. And at that point was the point where it was like, okay, it's time to hit the big pause button at that point. Once the pause button was hit, there's some advantages and disadvantages to that. So keep in mind, like, we're doing IR from remote. Like, a lot of IR firms fly out teams. We are not necessarily on site. So obviously we lose access to those resources as well. What was one thing about this, the client was understood the gravity of the situation, so he pulled it. That means pretty much business is done for the day. We kind of lucked out. I think this started on a Thursday or Friday, so we could start working through or helping them, assist them with the mitigation process. So at this point, when the cables are pulled, we're knocked offline, but then we use these cradle points. They're cell tower based connections to plug into our servers. So we had somebody go on site and unplug us from the network. Actually, I think they let us plug in. They just plugged into another network port and then put the cradle points. When the cradle points are plugged in, we can then have a VPN that connects back over to our office, and we can continue our work. So that's where we stay at for the weekend. At this point, the biggest thing for us was to collect as many IOCs and understand as much as possible while we have that pause button. Because what we're going to be doing on the side is writing signatures on every TTP and IOC that we can possibly get our hands on. Because the idea is, at some point, this network is going to come back online. So understanding from patient 0 to where we are now is obviously super critical. So that's basically how we spent that weekend. The IR team at this point was an on-site IR team had come in, and then they started using an EDR tool to go through and start doing a cleanup and some mitigation of the threat itself. And a lot of that was through, we could supply things like, for instance, as Mr. Drenning pointed out, the hashes for the scripts that they were using to stop different things, different services. We could push that out, identify those company-wide. So they were pushing the EDR tool everywhere. And then we go through and, give them like a whole crap ton of different hashes. We're talking to them about adding ACLs into firewalls, stuff like that. And then start mitigating it. Is there anything you guys wanted to add about on that part with the IR firm and then the cleanup process?
No, I think we'll cover a lot of it with some of these questions. There's some really good questions in the chat right now.
I was going to say we could probably start wrapping up and then start probably going through some of these questions too. So I mean, like at this point, the IR teams in there were assisting with them. It's kind of a back and forth with them on getting them the information.
Yeah,
so I guess
just combing through all the logs and trying to find needle in a needle stack, pretty much. It was
yeah,
go ahead.
What so it says, when did the attacker know that he was exposed during the attack? I would say during the time that we stopped the FTP traffic.
Where's that one? Does the attacker
at the very, very bottom here?
Okay, yeah. I'll click start.
That would be when, and that was kind of be a given. One of the other questions is, how did they have a server in Miami? They were renting it. So one of the things that we noticed from this group is that they typically use hardware. Like they don't host it in Azure or anything like that. And because of the amount of data that they're transferring, it makes a lot of sense. So what they do is they rent servers. We're actually able to identify, which we talk about in another article that's related to this whole thing, about the Black Basta backend. They rent servers and from I call them small hosting companies, but they might be medium sized. But so they'll rent like a actual one-use server and then have an extra 14 terabyte drive put in, and they use that. And that's how we knew about that.
Yeah, there's a million small hosting providers out there. Anybody can buy some hardware and spin up an LLC and just lease it, right? Oh, that was the case.
One of the things was, could you have detected the C2 communications during the attack? If it were known, maybe. Again, a lot of the C2 traffic was pretty clean, actually very, very clean at the time. And AMP did actually pick it up. I think from our standpoint, it would have been, well, we didn't have any visibility into that particular network where patient 0 was. Mm-hmm. So from our standpoint, it would have been really, really difficult.
I think we can two-part that with another question that was by Mr. Robertson. Why wasn't the original host quarantined at this point? Based on the timeline, it appears that you notified the customer prior to the Cobalt Strike going out. So not the case. I think maybe a little misunderstanding there. We didn't have AMP logging to us at the time. It did fire off an alert, and had it been logging to us at that time, which we were aware of, like we were in the process of integrating with it, we would have notified them. And now, right, as soon as an AMP alert now comes in, we notify them immediately within a few minutes. So it was just a matter of visibility. That's it. AMP did do its job, but it wasn't configured yet to automatically quarantine. So like I said, they were in the process of rolling that out, and it just wasn't set up yet. So it was just unfortunate timing.
Did the org have MFA on email? To be honest, I think they did, but I'm not 100% sure. So I'm a little iffy on saying that. But the user was logged in and downloading malicious code at that point. So MFA really wasn't going to help them at that standpoint. And were there follow-up attacks? Yes, we did note a lot of. Well, I wouldn't say a lot. You guys would know better than I would. How many follow-up attacks did you see?
I remember after everything was said and done, we did continue to see some phishing attempts. It was about 20 to 50.
We also saw them still trying to connect to the network via some of the same IPs that we saw connecting RDP from those RDP logs. A couple of those IPs were still trying to SSH or whatever back in. So,
gotcha. And why did they immediately encrypt everything? So it's one of the downsides of using a double extortion tactic.
Yep.
Is that you need to get the data out of the network, which buys you as a defender a lot of time to detect it. Like, so imagine you're sitting at the office and you look at your bandwidth usage and suddenly it's spiked through the roof. I mean, that might be an indicator that something wrong. You would probably go through and look at it. But these guys they want to do the double extortion because they feel they can get more money out of it and twist the victim's arm as much as possible on doing that. So I'd say that's why they didn't encrypt everything immediately. Had they done it immediately, it might have been a different story.
Yeah, if they didn't have to exfil, they could have been in and out of there in a day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do we see any log for J, stuff like that? I don't think that we did. They're mostly using phishing campaigns, as I recall.
Quick one. What sector was the client in? Construction. I think it says it in the article. Black Basta. Well, the client has multiple subsidiaries, but the construction segment or sector is what Black Basta was focusing on at the time in general, and that is why they were targeted.
To avoid retaliation, why not cut the whole system from the internet? They're a business, and they had business things going on. If you had asked me, I'd love to be able to do that and to say, hey, you guys need to cut it, and then we'll do it. But you're talking to a large organization, and their thing is like, well, but we also have a business to conduct. So they're trying to wade through the risks and things like that. Obviously, from our side, the risks are incredibly high. Yeah, pull it. But getting people on board with that can be very, very difficult.
You scroll to the top, we got some upvoted questions there related to privilege escalation. Trini, you want to take that one? Was privilege escalation involved, or could they do everything initially with standard user rights?
Unfortunately, we don't really have the logs from patient zero to say definitively one way or the other. But from what I've seen, my best educated guess is that there was some privilege escalation involved.
We saw the Kerber roasting, right? So we know that happened.
Mm-hmm.
So I think from that we can infer that they didn't have full privileges right off the bat.
Not off the bat.
They had to do some work.
There is a top question here. What were they using to stay hidden? Depends on where they were at. What we found interesting is so from the Black Basta standpoint, from their back end, their operational security was actually really good. They never connected to, for instance, the servers in Miami and things like that, other than through Tor, third-party VPNs, or services that they had set up. So for instance, if they had another hosting provider, they would connect from that. So they never connected from other places.
Just a regular ISP, yeah.
Right, like a regular ISP out of somebody's house. They never did that. So it was really interesting to see that. Where they did mess up is that they would trust the victim's network and connect back into their own backend. My point being is they would connect in to a compromised host, then SSH or whatnot back into their own network, and that allowed to observe a lot of different things. Which we have a write-up on that as well.
Yeah.
So should we? I know there's more questions coming in. Should we go through just the real quick takeaways and then see if we can answer some more? I want to run out of time on that.
Yeah, I think so.
So, do you guys want me to do it, or do you guys want to jump in?
I'll chime in as you go.
Sounds good. One thing that to me is still kind of amazing is organizations that this is a peeve of mine, who are resistant to doing things like egress firewall filtering, understanding the traffic that's leaving their network. The reason that I bring that up is that if you do egress firewall filtering and you baseline it and you do it right, then you give the attacker only certain avenues to go out. And if it's only certain avenues, those are easily to monitor. Just like you firewall to limit what can come into your network, if you limit what goes out of your network, then you can monitor those particular channels. We don't see very many organizations doing that. What more organizations type, I hate to say it, you'll say hey, consider doing better egress firewall filtering. And a lot of organizations will say, well, but that's not a new shiny tool that I can throw my budget at. And it's not, but it's a good practice. Obviously, I think MFA all the things. I mean, if you have a system in your network that is critical of nature, MFA it. A lot of organizations will do MFA at their VPNs and at their perimeter, but hey, once I'm inside, it's a little bit too difficult to do that. One thing that actually DeSorbo brought up earlier, there are technologies in the future that might be able to help us. If you think things like WebAuthn. Thank you for remembering that, Mr. De Silva. But technology like WebAuthn, which will make things like phishing and stuff like that, I think eventually probably obsolete because of the nature of the way a WebAuthn works. But we're not there yet. So in the meantime, MFA all the things that you can.
Yeah.
Dreading, you want to talk about domain trust?
Or zero trust.
Zero trust.
Inter-domain
Zero trust is incredibly difficult to implement, but it is imperative that as an industry, everything kind of moves towards that. I believe, I hate to quote something from Microsoft, but they put it really well when they said, never trust, always verify.
Yeah.
So every connection, every action, authentication is required.
It's obviously very difficult to put in place.
Incredibly so. But as kind of a stopgap as you work towards that, if you have an organization that has multiple domains that all fall under the same umbrella, limiting the trust or just completely, preferably eliminating the trust between those domains, that would be a huge step. Compartmentalize as much as possible.
I think a overall takeaway though here, and this is kind of all of these points play into it, is you can buy the most expensive, shiniest product on the market, right? You can pay for all the security in the world, but at the end of the day, good network hygiene and proper practices being implemented is what's going to save you post-compromise, because the biggest vector right now is the user, right? They're coming through phishing, right? You can't stop them from clicking. And once they get there, you just kind of have to assume that that's going to happen to most organizations at some point. Some user's going to click something they shouldn't. It's about what can they do after that happens, right? And that's why you do pen testing and things like that to assess those sort of things. But if you have all of these things in place, it makes it that much more difficult, right? You have MFA, you have zero trust, network segmentation, good egress firewall filtering, and another big one. I don't know if we talked about this yet, but Kerberoasting preys on RC4 encryption or bad encryption. So I understand that a lot of organizations out there may have legacy systems in place. You can segment those off, and you can, if they have to use RC4, then just only let those systems use it. But make sure that you have good, strong encryption in place, and then even post-compromise, like things like Kerberoasting just won't be applicable to your network, right? You want to pull away as many of those opportunities for any threat actor as you have, as you can. So.
Yes, agreed, 100%. One thing that we noticed in IR, know where your data is. Like, is nothing more frustrating than running around to figure out what appliance has what data on what in the middle of an incident. So knowing where your data is. And I think I mentioned the very blocking atypical, file types like ISOs. Again, like the fact that wasn't already being blocked that's actually, it's not a new technique to use ISOs for phishing campaigns, but for some reason, a lot of email software still allows it to head out. I was responding to, were there some legacy systems? Yes, there were. There were some, like a training facility or something like that. Any fear of encryption detonation occurring if there was a time lapse? Yes.
Let's get these answered. All right.
And I should point out WebAuthn, it's WebAuth and then the letter N, is a very, very new technology. It's not ready yet. So
I'll put a link in the chat for it if you guys want to read up on it. That's another webinar. It's a webinar for another day.
There's a question up there regarding the malware analysis perspective, talking about the how the malware was packed. I didn't see anything that jumped up and down and said, hey, this is directly related to one group or another. But as we continue and to look at other pieces of malware, anything that can be directly linked back or forward, depending on how you want to look at it, will be mentioned in future articles and things like that.
I've personally seen pieces of like kind of modules, since Conti got broken up, that kind of stuff gets sold for parts when it becomes open source or whatever. Qbot or Quackbot, we've seen in multiple other attacks, Brute Retel as well, and other ransomware chains. So you'll see some of this stuff, and a lot of the TTPs are very similar as well. A lot of the TTPs are very similar across these ransomware attacks.
One question is, what do you mean by the C2 traffic was clean? What I mean is, like, it hadn't been previously reported. The IP addresses haven't been previously flagged. That was a question that came up before. Was 122 cracked version of root retail? We think it was probably, well, Drenning, I should give him definitely credit for that. He thinks it's probably that was the cracked version.
Right.
All right, guys. Yeah, I gotta interject here because we're over time.
I want to keep going. It's great, but
Just trying to get through all the questions. Got 7 left.
Right.
Back to their day job. We hope this was valuable for you. We're a very open and collaborative organization, which I hope you kind of took a little bit from this to prove that. But if you have any questions or feedback after this, we encourage you to please reach out. You can email us at info@quadrantsec.com. And in addition to this webinar, I think we've mentioned in the chat a lot that there's some great technical write-ups of this event and some others at our website, which is Quadrant Sec, which is quadrantsec.com. I'll drop some links in chat for you to check out, but otherwise, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
I would say one thing too, if questions do come up in Reddit, we'll probably be monitoring that and answering there as much as possible too.
Can I type up the answers here? Will it stay open? Will the chat stay open once we close this?
It should.
Okay, so I'll try and type up answers to y'all's questions so I don't leave you hanging if I can. I think you guys should be able to see the answers. And then obviously, email us. We'd love to talk to anybody that wants to talk about it. So
yeah. Thank you everybody for coming.
Cheers.
Thank you.
It was great.